G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far that you are having a fantastic week. Now as soon as I finish this video, I'm running a little bit close on time, but as soon as I finish this, I step out the door, I'm going to go and see my oncologist, get my blood test results back and see if I am healthy enough to start chemotherapy next week. Then the following week I'll have those MRI results and I'll present them to you guys as soon as I know, either in the video or instantly as soon as I get the images on the Telegram. So you should come and join the Telegram. But legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. Now, in a lot of videos that I do, there are individual segments, like this bit's about diplomacy, this bit's about maps, blah, blah, blah. Today, as per some videos, a lot of it builds on itself. So we're going to start with the maps, show you some footage in that. We'll compare the maps. Then we need to talk about momentum on the battlefield. And I've named this Momentum, Facts versus Reality. We're going to go through some articles talking again about warfare being linear, and if warfare was linear, you and I would be fighting with a musket and a sword, probably somewhere in Italy. But then we need to look at what the data is showing us, that Russia is making more gains with less losses actually at the time reported from Ukrainian pages. And then look at some of our own data here as well. So there's a lot in that, and that's going to look at some statements that Trump has made also. And then we have in the third folder an update about the reality of war and how war is just diplomacy by other means and the brutal reality of attritional war. Also in that, we're getting from, we'll name him the drone guy who gave us that information regarding those longer range FPV strikes. I've got more today that I can actually share with you guys, as well as an overall picture of then failures, failures in the Russian Ministry of Defense, what is happening there, and a bit more too. And then right at the end, we're going to talk about a then official who was pushed out of Ukraine, who left under Yanukovych, being killed in Spain. Was this an inside job? Was it a hit? Was it a deal gone wrong? What was it? Others threatened. So we'll talk about that. So let's start on the maps. And here's Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014, the red check that you're going to see, ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. Now, the first place we're going to come down into is on the Pokrovsk front line, in and around Toretski here, Novomakhelivka. The geolocation on this isn't great. And what I'm speaking about is an image that you have probably seen, being that the Russian forces have then reached the border of Dnipro Oblast. Now, what we see is this vehicle then crashed into this barbed wire here and guys with Russian flags saying that they've reached that border. Now, this is not enough to get a geolocation to confirm that's where it actually is. That is just being claimed. But many pages, both Russian and Ukrainian, did say that these guys were then hit. So Ukrainian officials, they have dismissed this, and the military administration in Dnipro, they have called this fake and that it was fabricated. And we have also seen he's saying that it's just to frighten residents. Deep State, they said that the Russian soldiers were next to a pickup, but that pickup is actually a Ukrainian vehicle that came then under attack and was abandoned more near where I said of this Troitsky. There's nothing official yet, but just wait out on that, because what we do know is, well, it is advancing the front line in this direction. As you can see, to the south of Uspanivkia is advancing in that direction, and it is only a few kilometers away. So it is likely soon we will see more of that. And you can see this grey heading right near Novomakhelivka. Now, a lot of this Syriac has showed for some time, but let's say there's presence here. That's what grey zone is, that it's contested. There's presence. To the closest area is under a mile. It's 1.5 kilometers. So let's look then at any map updates here from Syriac Maps. Now, he is showing right on this corner, right in here, that the Russian forces have reached Dnipro Oblast, and then further down below than that Troitsky area that the Russians are pushing in this direction here, really just leveling out that front line down here, other than what we see is where it pushes out and then comes back in, as well as more ground made in and around Pishani, Shevchenko front line, just to the south of Pokrovsk in then this sector, expanding that control, as well as around Kotlene, that area had been taken back last week. But what I'm more interested in on the maps is actually to the east of Pokrovsk, because we see then Russia then expanding and fattening and lengthening and fattening their control on the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, the western flank of Toretsk. And I believe if you were to ask me which is the priority front line at the moment, it would be between this and Terny. I wouldn't know, I'm 50-50, but we can see that deep state map shows an advancement of somewhere in the vicinity of 3 kilometers today in the direction of Poppy Yar. But you can see the grey zone has expanded a lot further than that as well, from Alexandropil, Staromakalevkia, and Novopoltavkia also. So let's have a look at what then Suryak map says in here. Can see more in the direction of Poppy Yar. So he's really showing out to where the grey zone is sitting here, as well as some movement just to the east of Romanivkia as well. But this is an area that I explained in short yesterday, but I believe the Russians will do too. I think they will push on the north, and then they will push, or simultaneously push to the west. Remember, in warfare like this, to introduce maneuver into the battlefield, it has to be successive and simultaneous. And what they're doing here is they will focus on fattening this. By fattening that, it reduces your adversary's saturation of artillery, and drones is basically just a new form of guided artillery, and increases your line of control. So that is something we will look at, and I think we'll see day by day, out, fatten, slowly, but surely, as you know, 2 to 3 kilometers day to day. I'm not surprised to see that. Now, just to the east of here, we're talking about Toretsk, and this is where Suryak map is saying that Ukraine has taken some territory back. So where we are talking is territory that was never actually shown under control in these areas. Captured more positions north of Druzhba. So just to the north of Druzhba, the sector in here. So again, we don't know. The Russian advancement was never shown into here if it existed on Suryak. So it can't show if there was Ukrainian advancement back. And I think many times Deep State has actually fallen into that, not being able to show a Ukrainian advancement because it never showed then the Russian advancement to begin with. And then we'll come up into then the Raihodka front line, some of the remaining areas of Luhansk, just this sector in here. And we're talking just in here, this tree line here is what we're looking at, and there's a small settlement just below this called Serhivkia. So it's just this here, and that this tree line in here has come back under Ukrainian control. Again, never showed that movement to begin with. So that is all the map updates I have for you today. But a few things I just want to point out before we move is, yes, we're seeing these territories made, but we're still seeing in Sumy this, say, 90, we'll just round it up to 92, this being 1.5, this being, 20? Is that clicked right? Actually, it'd be less than, I think that includes across the border, but let's say 95 kilometer squares in here, still shown as grey. So it is not going to show as Russian controlled in any numbers that are brought up to show any momentum, even on our data charts yet. Okay, so we get this, and we're going to go a little bit more in depth in this. This is a pro-Ukrainian account, this Vitali, but it does some good graphs with data if you'd like to go and have a look. I'm an avid follower, but he says Russian attacks have stabilised around 170 a day, an unprecedented sustained rate. Reported losses are declining, while captured positions are rising again. Momentum appears to be shifting as territorial gains increase despite fewer losses. And he here has pushed back against many accounts that are saying there is a falling of frontline momentum for the Russian forces. And we have said, well, you can't really base your momentum of January and compare it to August of the year prior. I can't remember what was said, but Russia has 2 generals, January and February. And of course, you're referring to the winter months and the savagery of that, how that can then affect military movements. So let's have a look at this. Losses declining, territorial gains increase despite those fewer losses. And then this is the graph that he has then released. And what we can see here is in the red is total captured, in the blue is then Ivan's losses, then losses on the battlefield. And we can see an increase here and a decrease here. What we can see is for a lot of the time when we see then increase in territory made or losses of areas, we see an increase in then losses of personnel, which makes complete sense. But we do need to note with any data that the graphs are only going to be as good as the data that is plugged in, and the graph is only going to ever be as good as what you draw back out of that as well. For instance, people that use then stuff like this, but linear. So the losses here, or the advance column, this is based on Ukrainian Ministry of Defense figures. So we know that is very likely inflated. The kilometre squares, I'm unsure, or the lost areas, I'm unsure on what map that is actually going off. Maybe Deep State, or maybe the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense official lost areas too. So given this, and that both figures are likely skewed, so the lost areas will likely be less and the killed in action or losses will likely be higher, this graph may actually in reality be more extreme than it is showing, because both information being plugged into this is likely the best version of it. Does that make sense? Now, some analysts, they have tried to explain this chart by saying that, well, Russia is conducting smaller attacks, so attacks with less people. That less soldiers then are being able to take ground. That's how it's being explained. No, they're just using less guys. That explains this. But then you can flip that and go, yeah, but then you're using less people to take more areas. That's not a good sign either. Now, there is never going to be just a single reasoning for this. War is far more complex than just that. So there's a few things in this. So Russia, we have seen they have improved their assault doctrine. They have definitely improved their kill chain of artillery from missiles to drones. So yes, smaller attacks, they can then be more efficient. Motorcycles compared to a BMP with 10 guys in it compared to 10 motorbikes. But also, Ukraine, and I say maybe, they may be fighting in areas of which they are more inclined to withdraw from, or in such a position that they have to withdraw before it gets critical. So that, of course, can change these numbers around. But it's just interesting to look at those momentum figures before we then have a look at this, because this, of course, this influences how public opinion is formed and public outlook on the war when we know, well, it needs a little bit of nuance added. So we're going to go over our chart here as well, and we've got up to May 22 numbers. War Mapper is missing in action. AMK mapping, we have his numbers as well. So we get this from Bloomberg today. Now, it is titled, Russian advance in Ukraine is slowing despite Putin's confidence. They've only made small territorial gains this year amid steady resistance from Kyiv's military, undercutting President Vladimir Putin's assertions that his army has gained the upper hand in war. They talk about it's falling short of satisfying Putin's war aims. I agree with that. But the pace of Russia's main advance in eastern Ukraine has halved since the start of the year compared with a similar period through the end of 24, according to data compiled by Deep State. Again, given the data that you are taking, your outcome is only going to be as good as that data ever is. But here we talk about halved since the start of the year in a similar period of 2024. What about then the entire front line though? That's something worth asking, because that just means you can push other areas. What about then the near 100 square kilometres probably controlled in Sumy, the multiple hundreds of kilometre squares then taken back in Kursk, and of course, Russian movement in the south and around Terny. Okay, and I want to show you then this. So this is what we see. And this gives us 24, 25. So in this column here of month to month to month, we look at momentum on the battlefield. When we go back, we're looking at similar-ish conditions of the battlefield given weather. So what we can see is the momentum has actually been then increasing. We see, then we have May where we're at, and then April, and then March. We've seen an increase in this after a decrease from then January, February. But again, then we need to look at other figures in here and look at where AMK mapping is sitting and then this increasing and the difference between these two. So it is difficult to get an idea, but then you can go across to then last year and get an idea of, well, Deep State, he is, they have suggested that in April this year has made more ground than April last year as well, and in March too. And by War Mapper's the numbers, he's missing in action at the moment, we have that too. So comparing back, that is important, and comparing forward, again, this number, this is only occupied. This does not take into account, Kursk and gaining hundreds of square kilometres there. And it's not showing, at least on Deep State, into Sumy also. So it's not taking in the entire front line, and you can't just pinpoint one area. You need to take in the entire thing. The faltering diplomatic process means the future of Ukraine and Europe's broader security is likely to be shaped by events on the battlefield. I agree with that. Russia's military advanced on the order of 41 square kilometres per week into Ukrainian territory, on average down from the 125 square kilometres averaged from mid-August to the end of last year. But again, let's then wait for August, because we need to compare the same months if you're talking about weather. And I'd say on this, well, let's wait for these months and see where these changes then will be sitting. Now, the state of the battlefield is in marked contrast with the diplomatic shift in Putin's favour. I don't think it's in marked contrast with that. He looked to win time this week, phone call with Trump, who backed off ceasefire demands and sanction threats, raising fears in Europe that he was moving away from a long-touted commitment to reach a swift peace deal. No, I actually think that would say to me he's trying to reach a peace deal, because he knows if I just go in there all guns blazing and more sanctions, and demands that you're never going to accept, you're not going to get a peace deal. Again, love or hate Trump, at least he's trying something rather than just let's just hang up the phone, cut the cable and let it work itself out. Now, in a subsequent call with the European leaders, Trump signalled that he was convinced that Russia was winning, repeating a number of Kremlin talking points. Now, what I'll say in some of this is that the author doesn't understand how attritional warfare then works, how it then can be little by little and then all at once given these two paragraphs. But the repeating a number of Kremlin talking points, just because you say a point that someone else doesn't like, that someone else may be saying, that doesn't mean that that point isn't true. And I would say right now, given my assessment on the battlefield, and I think objectively assessing the battlefield, that you would say that Russia is winning on the battlefield. Is that a Kremlin talking point? Does the Kremlin say that? Yes. Does Trump say that? Yes. Do I say that as an analyst? Yes. Do many other analysts say it? Yes. It doesn't mean that it is their talking point, if that makes sense. You can't just then make all those points then useless and toxic because someone else repeats it. If you take this, I would say that the warfare is there's a misunderstanding of how attritional war works, and also trying to undercut any sort of assessment of, well, actually the battlefield looks like this. These are the issues at the moment, by just lumping all of it in there. Same as if someone calls you a racist in an argument, to just strawman any argument that you are trying to make. And what I'll say, if war moved in a straight line, you'd still be holding a musket. Now, Russia's current rate of advance, a region smaller than Belgium, it would take several years to fully occupy. Calculations based on deep state data, extrapolating from that, a purely theoretical exercise, occupying all of Ukraine, would take well over a century. Well, I ran 20 metres in 3 seconds this morning, so watch out Kipchoge, because I am going to run a sub 1 hour marathon. This is just a useless exercise to try and fit a narrative. This is not an exercise. This is propaganda by completely misrepresenting how, and purposely misrepresenting how a war like this actually works to fit a narrative. Because it would also be propaganda if Russia today, if Ukraine stepped back out of the Pokrovsk Eastern Front and Russia took 50 kilometre squares tomorrow. It would also be propaganda if I then came and said, at this rate of advance, Russia will take the rest of Ukraine in 3 months. Okay? Again, it's the way media move things that really does my head in. So why my videos are half an hour long. Now, from Eric Karamelia, a senior fellow at the Russian and Eurasian program in Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he said Putin's thinking that he can take all 4 regions swiftly or even anytime soon is not realistic at all. He said that Russia is only achieving localized breakthroughs. And at this moment in time, it may not be realistic, but we'll continue to see how the war will go. That's why they know it's going to be very difficult to take this. That's why they're going, can we take it diplomatically? Maybe. We will see. We'll see what Trump is. Otherwise, then we're going to have to do diplomacy by other means. Therefore, war. And they're right. None of the calculations minimise Ukraine's mounting challenges with a manpower shortage, a war-weary population, and waning support from the US under Trump. Well, does that not come into then how localized breakthroughs may become much larger, as well as your paragraph here about then your theoretical exercise, your propaganda piece about linear warfare rates? With fighting growing fiercer in the summer months, okay, but in the start of your article, you were comparing summer months compared to winter months, okay? The potential for Russian breakthrough on the front line remains a risk for Ukraine, even as Moscow's troops grind forward at a massive cost in casualties. yes, it's attritional war. There's going to be huge cost of casualties, and that doesn't just mean to the Russian forces either. Okay, attritional warfare like this is catastrophic, and the losses are absolutely huge. And what it will come down to is who can sustain those losses. It is absolutely horrible. This Yevgeny Brzezinski, a retired Russian general and Moscow defense analyst, he says every campaign reaches a breaking point when the front starts to collapse. The moment will come because Ukraine's problems are systemic. And this is exactly, if we use logic both ways, remember, you can use logic both ways. It is not illegal to do. And I've just broken the whole university system. But if you say that every economy has a breaking point, and by sanctioning Russia and treating the economy, then it will reach a breaking point and they won't be able to fight the war. War works very similarly. This is why we very often use analogies to do with economics around bankruptcy and attritional warfare militarily. And there is a breaking point. Now, if you were to ask me, is the breaking point Ukraine militarily, Russian economically, which one is closer? I believe militarily, but I'm open to the fact that it may be the other way as well, as it is very difficult to actually assess the Russian economy, being it's more closed than, say, like a more Western economy like Australia. Now, this guy here says, this is from Jack Waitling, a senior research fellow for land warfare at then RUSI, that Russia cannot sustain operations indefinitely. But for now, Moscow thinks its leverage over Ukraine will build over time. And Trump has strongly implied that he will withdraw from negotiations. The Russian military is set to intensify its operations. And again, I think that this is actually confirmed. This leverage will build over time. That's confirmed by people like Ursula von Continue Lying and Karen Kallas and a lot of, and even like Zelensky, because they are saying Putin is trying to purposely extend the war. And they are then throwing that out there as, well, we can take two things out of that. Okay, Putin's trying to extend the war because they calculate, they being the Russians, calculate it's in their favour. And you're using this to try and say that extending the war is bad because you know it's in Russia's favour and not in Ukraine's favour to extend that war. So yeah, I would agree off that, from the most pro-Western sources through the most pro-Russian of Karen Kallas to Putin, that extending the war is in Russia's favour. I think they all agree on that. Jack Waitling, he continues saying, while Russia can fight another 2 campaign seasons in its current approach to recruitment, further offensive operations in 26 will likely require forced mobilisation, which was both politically and economically challenging. Remember, we've heard about forced mobilisation now for years and years and years, and it keeps being like, now the next time. But in this, 2 more offensive operations in 2026, well, we'll see how that battlefield will continue deteriorating and if it will maybe reach a point in that. And then Kremlin's forces are making progress. The time is on Russia's side. This is according to an editor-in-chief of Defense magazine in Moscow, Igor Korotchenko. Whatever territorial gains Russia makes will objectively strengthen its hand in negotiations. And I agree with that. Again, at the end of the day, the battlefield is going to need to be taken into account, especially by someone like Trump, who is a realist. But let's look then at your own graph down here, Politico, and look at January compared to January. I don't see how those paragraphs before really make sense on this when we're talking about square kilometres and you're saying that there's then a reduction in the momentum. I don't think anything here actually really displays that, if that makes sense. And the idea of that it's only costing then Russia the casualties on the line, this is a narrative that has been put in place. I don't even know how that it's 1 million Russians to 0 Ukrainians dying in the front line. An attritional warfare where there is a side with an artillery advantage, potential drone advantage too, a fab advantage. There's no real analogue for that, not in the numbers. That the suggestion that there's going to be massive casualty rates overbearing one way and not the other, it needs to be 4-1 to be neutral in this too. And I'd have high doubts if it's that, even close to that, okay? So we need to be realistic about this too. And I think this complete idealistic view and propaganda has poisoned the well in so many ways, how people can see this war and then therefore won't make the best decision from this. So let's have a look at then my drone guy, and some of his opinion on this war. I should have done this earlier in the video. Now, this is the one that I can share. Now, this is further information from himself and his opinion on then the technology and how the Russian forces military defense is working. Now, what the Ukrainians are likely seeing, it's not a mothership, but probably some Garand-style drone with repeaters or transmitters, while another Garand probably dropping one or two FPVs for them to strike further. So what we originally thought, let me draw it just here really basic, was we thought that a drone left here, fiber optic control, landed somewhere. This is still controlled by fiber optic here, and then a radio controlled drone goes out from here and can then strike X target. What I believe he's more saying is, well, this one does go out and lands, but another drone itself then drops these FPVs and repeats off this one. Sorry, my napkin drawing there is a mess, but I hope that that makes sense. Again, we're just trying to get a better idea of, because again, he's not building these. He was working with those, making basically suggestions for what could work. He continues saying, for them then to strike further. I'm saying this because most of these further range attacks are coming during or after a Garand wave. Now, I can't confirm if these longer range FPV strikes are happening during a Garand wave or not, but keep an eye out and let me know if you do notice anything like that. I'll keep my ear to the ground. The mothership concept would possibly happen in the same place and time, but it would be unlikely since it's kind of a waste. It would be better in places where there are no huge Garand waves. This is my little rant to contextualize the Russian Ministry of Defense thinking as I experienced. Ukrainians have a bigger limitation on everything than the Russians. People, industry, resources, and people underestimate this because Ukraine is their patsy nation, the new South Vietnam of our time. Their high command is delusional with their own propaganda on the actions that they carry, show their own people that they are doing great, while in the reality, the high command does know things aren't going great. But if they admit that, that's a huge morale drop on the front line. And people of the nation, this could be a huge destabilising factor. You can constantly see lower officers saying that the high command in the Ukrainian army is incompetent and are just living in delusion. This could be an explanation, not because they're stupid, just not to further compromise the country's morale. While the men in the front understand it, the people who are supporting in Lviv have little to no idea the reality. Imagine what would happen with mass panic. That could be catastrophic. So basically saying some of the high command, they're not delusional to this. They know exactly how it is, but they're also trying at that level, unlike the mid to lower ranks, they're trying to also balance then the overall society's vision of this also. Now, people will correctly point out that the Russians failed miserably at the beginning of the war, and they did. But the problem that people fail to understand is that they failed not to save face, not to avoid create panic, but due to flawed information. And people just don't understand how it's to gauge people's opinion. Take Afghanistan, for example. The same bloke who one day was smiling at you could be shooting at you at night or planting IEDs. And to further illustrate my point, the Russian initial invasion made sense with the information they had. Now, hindsight is 2020. Now we know it wasn't like this, and the Russian high command had to understand who was committing vrania, or in other words, lie to save one's ass. And to replace these people, which takes time and is awfully hard, because how do you know who is actively lying to cover their asses and who's sending a false information based on a wrong report and who's got the original information wrong that compromises the chain of communication? We have seen very large changes in Russia's command. And what he is saying here is, yes, they failed, but even by then their information they had, they thought they would succeed. And this is even through to information we know in the West. The whole 3 days thing that came out of Ukraine will fall in 3 days, that was Western assessments of this. So what he's saying is, yes, they failed, but it was due to poor information, and that's why it did. And now they're trying to figure out where all this wrong assessment came from. Okay, since people in NATO and the West, even some NATO personnel, insist the Russians are orcs that can't adapt, can't change, everyone is super corrupt in the Russian forces, they will continue to fail to understand how resourceful the enemy truly is. Now, in Protracted, Planning for Protraction by Iskander Rahman, he says along the lines of, under the pressure of war, never underestimate your enemy. To further illustrate this one with an example, did you see those little robots that dig to run underground fiber optics cables or other cables? A lot of the time used not for warfare purposes, but these are used for digging in cables in areas around the world too. What if you could put a few kilograms of C4 on those and guide it to a Ukrainian trench? Now, the people manning the trenches have to worry about that as well. Besides drones from the air, what a terrifying idea. That I and some of my colleagues did suggest. They liked the idea asked us to build a prototype, which, well, in certain terrains, it worked wonderfully, though it's kind of expensive. I assume you would see limited use. So it had some problems in this. Remember, he was giving ideas here too. Very interesting position. Now, things like this, just cheap remote control drones, maybe even those big toy ones with some explosive cord, you could drag that across the field and then detonate it to blow up mines in a path. While Ukraine wants multi-million-dollar systems, people make fun of the Russians for achieving the same result, with let's say 20% less efficiency with a fraction of the cost. So yes, it's not as good, but it is 20% worse for sometimes way less cost. Space Race is actually a good example of this. This sort of mentality that fails to understand that every war is an economic matter, regardless of if it's a quick blitz or a super aggressive maneuver war or a protracted stagnant war. Every single system costs money, time, and resources. The cheapest you can accomplish with the same objective, the better you are. It doesn't matter if you can collapse the enemy nation in 4 weeks and then having to deal with an occupation, because you didn't degrade their fighting spirit. And to be brutally honest and quite cynic, you didn't kill enough of their people to avoid fighting resistances. This mentality of we're the nice guys, we only target the ones shooting at us doesn't work in reality, because the one guy you killed now has 8 friends who were on the fence, 12 family members that now hate you, and so now you have 20 insurgents to deal with. We've spoken about this in Attritional War, that exhaustion attritional war does really limit uprisings following that. Great example is then Nazi Germany at the end. Doesn't mean there aren't uprisings, but it means that the exhaustion isn't there. Of course, this is a very cynical view of this, but he's touching on some very important stuff here and the actual brutality of war. War is horrible, and people need to understand this. Just to clarify, I have no dog in this fight. I don't care who wins and who loses. If a Ukrainian IT company hired me, my opinion would be the same. I know, very cynic of me. But as I see, Russia is more likely to win territory, their people and resources. So I would say Russia is more likely to win this war. Now, he also follows up saying, excuse me for my poor English as well. I don't live in an English nation. I had to work in systems to enter then this battlefield. But it is very interesting to look at, and I hope you enjoy that sort of direct information and opinion on things too. And it is interesting to see talking about the direct failures of the Russian ministry and the information on the movement, on the offensives into Ukraine at the very, very start. And we want to look at now Marco Rubio talking about a solution to this war. And what I will say, actually, I'll say it after. So let's listen to what he says here.
And here's what we can all agree on. There is no military solution to this crisis.
Right.
It will have to end in a negotiated settlement. And the fundamental challenge we have in Ukraine is this. Russia wants what they do not currently have and are not entitled to, and Ukraine wants what they cannot regain militarily. And that's been the crux of the challenge.
So what Russia wants, they do not have the rights to. What Ukraine wants, they don't have the military power to take back. But what I'll say is, throughout history, war is diplomacy by force. War is politics by other means. And this is exactly why war actually exists. War exists in many ways to take something of which is not yours to have the right of, to conduct politics, because in the political theatre, no one will ever actually accept that. So you put military force. And what I've said is Russia is employing the strategy of war that we haven't seen for a long time. Well, it's actually not been that long, but along those by force, power politics, that is what they're doing. They're using power politics to gain power over things of which it may not or are not theirs. But that is the way they are conducting politics. They are conducting politics by war. And I know this is incredibly foreign to a lot of leaders around the world. Maybe they should read Henry Kissinger's Diplomacy and see through all the centuries prior to this that many ways, maybe not following the 30 Years' War, but then in many ways from Napoleon to Bismarck was probably the greatest example of this, through the uprisings of Germany, how power politics, real power politics, actually works. So it's interesting there, but it's sort of touching on, but this is why then war actually exists, and that war is diplomacy by force, that it isn't fair, it isn't right. But that's why that war then exists. If you get everything that you wanted diplomatically, war wouldn't then exist, or if you had perfect balance of power, which you can never have. Now, we've seen that Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has basically turned down the truce, and TASS is reporting this here, that the truce and sea approach is resolving the conflict with Ukraine. It just won't fly anymore, no matter how much the European leaders push on this. He said that Istanbul 22, Russia and Ukraine, initialed the settlement principles proposed by the Ukrainian delegation. We agreed with them. They were initialed both by us and the Ukrainians. And then the West forbade signing a treaty based on these principles. This is why now that we're told, let's have a truce, and then we'll see. So that's what Zelensky's 30-day truce ceasefire is meant to be, is let's have a truce, let's ceasefire, and then we'll see where this goes from here. And Lavrov is saying we're not doing that. And this is really a big confirmation that he's not. No, guys, we've already been through this and we don't want to do this anymore. And the Macrons, the Starmers and the von der Leyens and other European figures who are now hysterically demanding that the US join the anti-Russian actions and increase the number of sanctions simply give them away. So he's saying by the hysterical nature of you wanting to do this, this tells us a lot about the next steps of what you're trying to do with these ceasefire, with these truce. And this has been my question, and I'm not a big enough YouTuber to sit down with any of these leaders, and they would never sit down with me, but like a von der Leyen or a Kaja Kallas or any of these go, okay then, what if they say no? What happens then? Ursula, okay, Ursula, let's just go that your ceasefire goes up, Putin just says no, and I want to continue the war, and then your 18th sanctions package has the exact same effect as the 17 prior to that. What do you do? What's the next step? Are you deploying forces? No. Okay. You're giving more weapons to Ukraine in massive, huge amounts? No. What then? Like, what happens then? Okay. And then what happens then if Russia does play then power politics to gain areas? How then do you deter other nations from saying, well, maybe we're back on the cards of this? Remember that politics seems to sort of go in like ebbs and flows, and you have like a period of this and a period of that. And could you potentially open a period of, well, okay, there are a lot of areas around the world that are contested, and X country thinks they've got this. You know, there are claims into Ukraine from states on their western border. What happens then? Are we going to go into a period of power politics, again, that we haven't seen in a long time due to the complete destruction around the world post the Second World War? Now, we see this. Andriy Portnov, a former top official in Ukraine's ex-president Viktor Yanukovych administration, was shot dead in unidentified attackers outside American school in Madrid. A source from Ukraine's military intelligence, GUR, said that he was shot dead, but no further details have come up. He was shot 5 times, suffering at least 3 wounds to the head and torso. That Spanish outlet has written 2 or 3 people have been involved in this, and they're suggesting it was maybe a debt issue as a motive for this. Portnov was approaching a Mercedes car when he was surprised and shot by the attackers. Now, many are speculating a lot about this, except for all the Western media who is ignoring this, but it could be a debt issue. It may well be a debt issue. I wouldn't be surprised by that. But it could also very easily be a targeted killing to send a message for those who are deemed pro-Russian, or send a message to politicians who may have competition to Zelensky in upcoming elections, if and when that does happen. And there's been many other accounts who have ties back to Ukraine politically, who have been extradited from Ukraine, pushed out, who are saying that, well, shit, this seems like a bit of a risk. And it may just be a debt issue. I'm not saying it may just be that. But it has a lot more hallmarks of like targeted killing here. It's a European NATO state. Remember when Sarah Ashton Cirillo, who we just don't say anymore, but was an official spokesman for the Ukrainian armed forces, said the propagandists will pay for their crimes. Russian propagandists will be hunted down and justice will be served. Could we see a lot more of this to try and send a message to those who are against the powers that be currently? A lawmaker from the Ukrainian Liberal Holos Party has said it doesn't matter to us whether he was a useful idiot or a paid agent. He undoubtedly acted in Russia's interests, although from my reading did actually support Zelensky at some times. And what some people are saying is, does he have too much dirt on that regime? Now, regardless of what the investigation actually finds, I think it'll have the same fate as the Nord Stream investigation of what happened? I don't know where. Anyway, legends, you have a fantastic day. I will speak to you tomorrow, and I'll let you know how we go with starting then the chemotherapy next week, because I'll have the results tonight. Anyway, thanks, guys. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.